A single piece of evidence can hold the key to solving a complicated crime, if it can be found. Kim Dorsey, a beautiful woman, wife and businesswoman, is found dead. Her home is turned upside down, and evidence is scattered everywhere, none of it seemingly connected. Among the chaos, investigators hope to find the one clue that will unlock the mystery of what happened inside the house. A puzzle piece hidden in the dark that could answer why an innocent woman lost her life in her own home. Or perhaps she wasn't so innocent after all? It was around 8 a.m. on Sunday, October 28, 2012, when Derek Dorsey pulled up to his home in East Jacksonville, Florida. He had just finished a 24-hour shift as a firefighter. Since Saturday had featured a college football game, Florida versus Georgia, emergency crews had been extremely busy, and Derek was exhausted. All he wanted was to lie down next to his still sleeping wife, Kim. At the front door, he noticed something unusual. A small dog figurine placed there in memory of Kim's late pet had been knocked over, but Derek was too tired to give it much thought. He walked straight into the bedroom, which was dark thanks to blackout curtains. He expected to see his wife in bed, but instead, she was lying on the floor, naked, face down. At first, Derek thought she had tripped and hit her head, or maybe had too much to drink the night before. But then he saw the blood, a lot of it. His emergency responder instincts kicked in. In the darkness of the bedroom, he began performing first aid and called 911. His fellow firefighters quickly responded, sirens blaring, heading straight for his house. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. Derek desperately tried to revive Kim, but at last he had to face the truth. Her body had already grown cold. It was too late for Kim. After years of saving others, he hadn't been able to save his own wife. With resignation in his voice, Derek told the dispatcher, "My wife is dead. She cut herself with a knife. I think she did something to herself." Kind, cheerful, independent, and incredibly smart, Kim was an extraordinary person. It's no wonder Derek fell head over heels for her the moment they met. By their second date, he already knew he wanted to marry her. But Kim, who was studying to become an engineer at the time, wasn't in a hurry. 7 years passed before Derek finally mustered the courage to ask the big question, and Kim simply stood up and walked away. Derek was sure he had ruined everything. But then Kim returned and pulled a small, elongated box out of her purse. Inside was a bracelet engraved with the word yes. They got married a year later and dove headfirst into their careers. Now, Derek worked as a firefighter and also ran a small construction business. Kim completed her studies and began training and preparing building inspectors. Within just 2 weeks, she was asked to lead the entire department. They didn't have children yet. Both were focused on building successful careers. Besides, their jobs took up most of their time, but they shared their home with 3 dogs. Despite their busy schedules, the couple would take the dogs to the park every weekend and went on long walks with them every day. However, the workload began to take its toll. It became increasingly difficult for Kim to switch off and relax. She sought help from a specialist for depression. He prescribed her medication, and it worked. She became her old self again, cheerful and spontaneous. But the relief didn't last long. The medication came with side effects that caused a lot of problems. Kim lost sleep, began gaining weight, and was constantly tired and irritable. She felt trapped in a vicious cycle and feared that abruptly stopping the medication would plunge her into an even deeper depression. She planned to discuss it with her doctor, but never got the chance. That's why Derek assumed she had tried to quit the medication all at once, which led to such a tragic outcome. Meanwhile, detectives arrived at the Dorsey home. They had been informed that the victim had inflicted the injuries on herself. Their task was to confirm this in person, and they expected it wouldn't take long. But what they found in the house was chaos. From the look of the bedroom, something terrible had happened there. A revolver with a pink handle, a knife, and a broken pool cue were lying on the floor. Blood spatter was visible on various walls, but most of the blood had soaked into the carpet. The victim's body was not only covered in blood, but also bruised. There was no way Kim could have inflicted such injuries on herself. The rest of the house, especially the kitchen, told the detectives even more. Cabinets were left wide open. Cigarette butts were scattered across the kitchen floor, even though Kim didn't smoke and didn't allow smoking in her home. And it was highly unlikely she would let someone throw cigarette butts on the floor. The butts were sent off for DNA analysis. There were also bullet holes in the ceiling. But the most surprising and baffling detail was that the remotes for the family's entertainment system were found in the kitchen sink, along with Kim's mobile phone. Overall, everything in the house screamed that Kim had fallen victim to a brutal attack. What the detectives saw clearly contradicted the statement Derek Dorsey had made to the emergency operator. How could he think his wife had harmed herself after seeing the scene? That was just one of the many questions investigators wanted to ask the man. So, still wearing his firefighter uniform, he was taken to the station. He explained that he hadn't been home for 24 hours because he was working. He had called his wife several times on Saturday, and she hadn't answered, though he added this wasn't unusual enough for him to start worrying. Derek spoke about Kim's struggle with depression and then with the side effects of the medications. From the detective's questions, Derek guessed that his wife had been murdered, that she hadn't done it to herself. He asked the detective directly, and the detective confirmed his suspicion. The bedroom was dark when he got home, and that may have caused him to misjudge the situation. Because of this, and without fully realizing what had happened, Derek, a trained firefighter, broke one of the cardinal rules of a crime scene: do not touch anything. He covered his wife's body with a blanket to shield her nudity. But he did this after his colleagues had arrived, and they saw him do it. Derek was very open during the conversation. He admitted that he and his wife had grown apart physically and hadn't been intimate for several weeks. When the investigator asked directly if either of them had been involved in an affair, Derek, without hesitation, confessed to being unfaithful. The only thing left to determine was whether his affair could have been a motive for Kim's murder. Derek's alibi checked out. He was at work. Surveillance cameras at the residential complex confirmed that he had left that morning. There were also the missed calls on Kim's phone, just as he'd said. But even so, the detectives were not yet ready to rule out the husband as a suspect. The detectives got to work. They immediately noticed that the entrance to the residential complex where Kim and Derek lived had gates. However, it turned out that the gates had been left open on Saturday because one of the residents needed them to stay that way. This meant that Kim could have been attacked by a stranger who happened to be near her home and targeted the family's valuables. But the more the police examined the house, the more they realized that this wasn't a random attack. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant either Kim had opened the door for her killer or he had let himself in. Moreover, a burglar wouldn't have left empty-handed. Kim's Hummer was parked in the driveway. Valuable items and computers were clearly visible inside the house, and there was a Rolex watch near the bed. But nothing shouted "not a random crime" louder than Kim's body. She had been brutally beaten, at some point bound with zip ties, and likely sexually assaulted. The killer must have been full of rage toward the victim to do something like that to her. The officers questioned the Dorsey family's neighbors. One of them recalled that on Saturday, there had been a small SUV parked in front of the family's house. However, it didn't raise any suspicion at the time. The neighbor hadn't seen the driver. The autopsy revealed that Kim died on Saturday morning, shortly after her husband left for work. Her phone, which had been damaged after being thrown into the kitchen sink, stopped working around the same time. According to the crime scene analysis, Kim had just gotten out of bed when her killer entered the bedroom. She was likely asleep and woke up to a noise. She was standing by the bedroom door when the attacker struck her in the face, breaking her nose. The pain from such a blow is excruciating. Eyes instantly fill with tears, and people usually fall to the ground. But judging by the blood spatter, the killer didn't stop there. He kept beating her again and again, so violently that she eventually lost consciousness. Kim lay on the floor for some time, as indicated by the pool of blood on her side of the bed. Then the attacker zip-tied her to the nightstand. This gave him time to leave the bedroom and search through drawers and cabinets in the kitchen. However, that short break also gave Kim time to regain consciousness, free herself, and do something incredible. She retrieved her revolver from the nightstand to which she had been tied. It's unlikely that she could see clearly after being struck in the face, but she probably heard the killer moving around in the nearby kitchen. She might have heard him coming back. Relying on sound, she fired 5 shots through the bedroom doorway. The bullets hit the kitchen ceiling, but unfortunately, none struck the attacker. Even after that, she didn't give up. Kim got up. She didn't dare run into the kitchen through the door. She dropped the now useless gun and in desperation rushed to the window on the opposite side of the bed. She pulled back the curtains, slightly opened the blinds, and was ready to climb out when the killer caught her. He viciously beat her again with a pool cue, so violently that he broke her ribs. She collapsed to the floor, but he showed no mercy. The killer stabbed her in the neck with a knife. The autopsy also indicated that the attacker most likely sexually assaulted Kim in multiple ways. Although the pathologist couldn't find clear evidence of forced intercourse, investigators doubted that anything had happened with her consent. So the autopsy and forensic findings painted for the detectives a picture of a brave but ultimately doomed struggle by Kim. But this grim scenario also revealed something important about the killer. The zip ties used to restrain Kim, the pool cue, and the knife were all items that belonged to the Dorsey household. This meant the murderer had been in the house before and knew where to find those items. First and foremost, Derek knew, but he wasn't the only one. You see, Derek and Kim Dorsey were an extremely welcoming couple. They often let not only friends but also people in need stay at their home. For instance, at different times they had taken in Lance Kirkpatrick and Joshua Veal. Derek immediately ruled Lance out. Lance was his friend, had worked for his construction company, and Derek was sure he would never harm a woman. Besides, Lance couldn't have done it. Right before Kim's death, he had landed a new job on a boat in Georgia. Joshua's situation was far more complicated. Not only was he in town, but he had also run into trouble with the law before. Joshua was a young man who had worked for Derek for a time. He didn't have much experience in construction, but Derek needed people who were willing to work, so he gave Joshua a job and later allowed him to live in their home. Joshua had stayed with the couple for several months. Overall, Derek and Kim wanted to help him get back on his feet and find a path in life. But they hadn't succeeded because the young man preferred indulging in the pleasures provided by illegal substances to working. Derek was eventually forced to ask Joshua to move out, but they parted on good terms. And when Joshua occasionally asked for work, Derek never refused him because Joshua really did great work when he showed up. However, Joshua never gave up his bad habits. He was arrested for possession of illegal substances and was released just a day before Kim's attack. And there was something else important for the investigators. On the Sunday morning, just before Derek found Kim's body, he had stopped at a gas station to meet Joshua and give him a ride to work. But the young man never showed up. The gas station camera captured only Derek. After everything the investigators had learned, they were eager to speak with Joshua. However, he wasn't hiding. He tried contacting Derek again. The men agreed to meet at a local diner, but there the detectives were already waiting for him. They took him to the station for questioning. The officers began questioning Joshua cautiously, trying not to give away that they were investigating Kim's murder. The young man explained that he had spent the weekend with friends and had missed his meeting with Derek because he had slept through it. Slowly, the detectives steered the conversation toward the main topic, Kim. They wanted the 21-year-old to explain his relationship with the 38-year-old victim. Joshua admitted that he was very fond of her. There had been no romantic relationship between them, but Joshua admired her beauty, as well as her kindness and generosity. When the detectives finally told him that Kim had been murdered, the young man was in disbelief. He had just spoken with Derek half an hour earlier, and Derek hadn't mentioned anything about it. Joshua was genuinely upset and broke down in tears, as if he had been told that someone very close to him had died. His emotional reaction seemed so sincere that one of the detectives couldn't help but try to comfort him. Joshua's alibi checked out. He hadn't been anywhere near the Dorsey residence on Saturday. His name was removed from the list of suspects. Derek's alibi was also very solid. The detectives were still unsure about what to think of him. They knew he had been an unfaithful husband, which gave him a possible motive. But if he had hired someone to kill Kim, why was he acting so openly and trying so hard to help? He called every day, wanted to know how the investigation was progressing, and tried to be useful. When the crime scene investigators were done, he agreed to walk through the entire house with the detectives, commenting on anything that seemed strange to him. Perhaps he would notice something the investigators hadn't caught. One of the things they asked him to do was turn on the media center. Not that they had a specific reason for the request, but the remote controls in the sink were bothering them. Derek switched on the TV and flipped to the DVD menu, where adult content appeared on the screen. Derek was overwhelmed with emotion. He immediately said that the disc wasn't his, and Kim would definitely never watch something like that. The killer must have done this, he said. And then Derek remembered something important. The specialist who had set up the complex TV system in their house was there the day before Kim's murder. In fact, the system was so complicated that it required using 5 remotes to watch anything. Kim and Derek had called the technician to simplify it and make it possible to operate with just 1 remote. This meant that he was another person who had been in the house and knew the layout of the rooms. His name was JR. Derek knew him through work and had no reason to suspect him. But who else could it be? What if he had come back to steal the expensive system that he had just installed? The detectives paid a visit to the technician. JR hadn't heard about Kim's death yet and initially thought the detectives were inquiring about Derek. He didn't deny being in the Dorsey house recently and noticed some tension between the couple. While he was setting up the TV, Kim mentioned she was going to the gym, but Derek didn't respond. The lack of reaction from the husband struck JR as odd. When he himself was informed about Kim's death, he seemed too calm, too composed, but strangely, he expected others to react more emotionally. However, it wasn't just his behavior that caught the attention of the police. As is often the case, the victim had fought for her life. But could JR have made a move on the beautiful Kim, not noticing the lack of affection between the husband and wife? The detectives wanted to know the answer to that question, but JR said he had cut his hand at work. They asked for a DNA sample, and he agreed. Only after the detectives left did it dawn on him that they weren't interested in him as a witness, but as a suspect. He initially thought Derek was guilty, as Derek seemed to be a rather hot-headed person. In any case, JR's alibi checked out. The police had now eliminated 2 suspects from their list, but they didn't believe they had hit a dead end. There was so much information in the case that they felt it would be solved soon. The flow of information was only increasing. A police report arrived at the sheriff's office containing a small detail that turned the case upside down. It was a report related to a completely different car theft case, and it might have gone unnoticed if not for an attentive officer who spotted the name of the potential car thief. The woman reported that she had been at a party at a friend's house, and one of her acquaintances asked to borrow the car for a short time but never returned. This happened on Saturday night, just hours before Kim's murder. The woman's acquaintance was named Lance Kirkpatrick. He was the very same friend of Derek's, who had lived in his house and, according to Derek, wouldn't have lifted a finger against his wife. The police hadn't been looking for the man because he was supposedly working on a boat at sea, but this report cast doubt on that statement. The police recalled the neighbor's statement who had seen a small SUV near the Dorsey family's house. The description of the SUV matched that of the stolen vehicle. The detectives checked the surveillance footage, and indeed, around the time of the crime, the stolen SUV passed through the gates of the residential complex where the victim lived. However, the driver was not captured on video. The investigators were becoming more eager to speak with Lance Kirkpatrick. However, they didn't know where he was. What if he really was on the boat out at sea, and the woman was lying about him? The police were skeptical of her statement because she was known for her addiction to illegal substances. In fact, in circles like hers, it wasn't uncommon for someone to trade a car for drugs, so she might have given the car to someone else. However, the investigators had no way of contacting the boat where Lance supposedly worked. Lance's family didn't communicate with him much and didn't know where he was either. At that point, the detectives invited Brian Kiefer to the station. It was at Brian's house where the party had been held when the guest's SUV was stolen. Brian confirmed that he had invited friends over to his house, and Lance Kirkpatrick had indeed been there. Brian told them that Lance had taken someone's SUV to go buy illegal substances but never came back. However, on Sunday, Lance called him, asking to meet at a gas station. When they met, Brian immediately noticed that Lance had a wound on one of his hands. Brian was completely unprepared for what Lance was about to say. Lance blurted out that he had committed the murder and was going to prison, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Brian didn't understand what he was talking about, but Lance went on to explain that on Saturday morning, he had entered the house of his boss, Derek Dorsey. There, he ran into Kim. Upon seeing him, the girl grabbed for her phone and Lance panicked. He took the phone from her and told her to get out of the way because he just needed his things. But the confrontation quickly escalated. Lance told Brian that he beat the girl with a pool cue, and she fired 5 shots at him from a revolver. He even mentioned the last words she said. As she was dying, she uttered, "Stop, you're killing me." Lance's story was so horrifying that Brian didn't believe him. However, the police were listening to Brian with keen interest. They thought that Brian had just described the murder of Kim, mentioning details only the killer could know, like the remotes in the sink. The problem was, Brian himself could have been the murderer. He also had access to the SUV, and although he was now running a building repair business, he had a criminal past. Still, it wasn't clear what his motive could have been or why he would have broken into the Dorsey home and waited for the moment when the gates to the complex were open. Now the detectives had to find Lance and hear his side of the story. Fortunately, Brian knew where to find him. Lance was brought to the station. He explained that he had borrowed money from Derek Dorsey for a trip to the sea, where a job awaited him. After that, he came to Jacksonville for just one day, on Saturday, October 27th. He wanted to see Derek and drove to his house. He knocked on the door, but no one answered, so he left. In other words, he had just admitted that he was at the house of the murdered woman on the very Saturday, October 27th, when the crime occurred. The detective asked if he had entered the house. Lance responded no, especially since the key wasn't in its usual place. Wait a minute. What key? Lance had just slipped up and mentioned something the investigators had suspected from the beginning. The spare key was under a dog statue by the entrance to the house. Suddenly, the tipped-over statue made sense. Lance must have moved it to get the key. He knew it would be there as he had once lived in the house and had surely used it before. All the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Lance was arrested on charges of murdering Kim Dorsey. However, the investigators still didn't have an answer to the question that had been troubling them from the beginning. Was Derek involved in his wife's murder? Could he have enlisted his friend's help to get rid of Kim? Perhaps her life was insured, and Derek planned to profit from it. The police examined his gadgets and bank accounts, but found nothing that could link him to the murder. No messages or transactions between Derek and Lance concerning the murder. No funds transferred to Lance's account. In fact, without his wife's financial contribution to the family budget, Derek's situation had only worsened. It was clear he had no interest in her death. He was finally cleared of suspicion and informed about Lance's arrest. Derek didn't immediately grasp what was being said. He thought Lance might have been involved in a traffic incident or something similar, but when they explained everything to him, he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that Lance had killed his wife, the woman who had always treated him like a friend, who had allowed him to live in her home. Lance Kirkpatrick did not plead guilty to breaking into the house, assaulting, or murdering Kim. However, there was plenty of evidence against him. In addition to the testimony of Brian Kiefer and the surveillance footage showing the stolen SUV, forensic experts found Lance's DNA on Kim's body, on a cigarette butt, and on the pool cue he used to beat her. Knowing this, Lance changed his story by the time the trial began. He admitted to delivering the fatal blows to Kim, but he claimed it was in self-defense. Here's what he told investigators. He had come to the family home to retrieve a sweater with Georgia written on it that he had left behind. Kim opened the door and let him in. Lance explained that it was his adult film that the investigators had found in the DVD player. The disc had come free with an adult magazine bought at a nearby gas station. He began watching the film. Kim wasn't interested in such films, but became curious about Lance. They went to the bedroom and engaged in intimate activities, after which Kim's mood changed drastically. Lance believed this change was due to a strong medication she had been taking. They argued. Kim grabbed a revolver from the nightstand and started shooting. When the revolver ran out of bullets, Lance grabbed the pool cue and began swinging it indiscriminately. The blow knocked Kim unconscious. At first, he tied her up with zip ties and planned to wait for the police, but then changed his mind. He went to the kitchen for scissors, but couldn't find them, so he took a knife, intending to cut the zip ties with it. However, he couldn't do this without cutting Kim in the process. He went back to the kitchen, and when he returned, Kim had freed herself and was standing with the knife. They began fighting again, and before Lance realized what happened, the knife was on the floor, and so was Kim, dead. He waited for the police for some time, but when they didn't arrive, he left because he was scared. His version of events was somewhat supported by the fact that the coroner could not determine whether Kim had been sexually assaulted. But there were several inconsistencies in his story. When Kim started shooting, based on the trajectory of the bullets, she was lying on the floor. Why would she have laid down during the argument just to then pull out the revolver from the nightstand? Even if we assume that part of the story was true, why did he grab the cue and begin hitting her with such force that he broke her ribs? After she emptied the revolver's cylinder, why didn't he just turn around and run out of the house? Why engage in a struggle with a girl who, by his own admission, was in an impaired state? The jury didn't believe Lance. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. He will serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Derek Dorsey believes Lance got off too easily. It was extremely difficult for Derek to start his life over after the death of his wife. He left the fire department and found solace in his late wife's beloved pets. Every time he looks at the dogs, he remembers Kim, how she always tried to help others. Unfortunately for Kim, help came too late.